She cheated on me with the guy that I thought was her cousin. This occurred in 1998, give or take a year. I was approximately 22 years old at the time and had been dating this lady for about 1.5 years. I was smitten by her because she was stunningly beautiful, intelligent, and humorous. She was just a year my junior, but she still lived with her father, who was quite strict. Even though she was 21, he imposed a slew of restrictions on her, including curfews. Surprisingly, he assumed she was a virgin, despite the fact that I wasn't even her first. When he realized we were having, he informed her she couldn't see me anymore. We continued to date, but it was increasingly difficult since she was always sneaking about. She'd often use her cousin as a pretext to get to me, but she regularly stopped at his house for a long to have a cover story. She said that they had been close since they were children, so this was natural. I eventually discovered that her cousin was not, in fact, her cousin. He was her father's closest friend's son, but according to her, she always called him cousin and thought of him as a cousin. I began to notice more and more things that appeared out of the ordinary, and I became really suspicious. She informed me one day that she was going to have lunch at a specific place and would then come over. Soon later, I received a message on my pager instructing me to meet at Red Lobster at 12 p.m. Then I received another message informing me that the communication was intended for her father. I dashed over to the restaurant, located her vehicle, and parked a long distance back. Another vehicle arrives, her relative gets out, and they embrace and kiss before heading inside. I returned home to wallow in my pity. I canceled our date on that day, but I didn't notify her. I quickly devised my terrible scheme. I must inform you of any event that occurred earlier in our connection. When she was getting ready one day, I took a Polaroid of her buttocks. It was just a close-up of her buttocks, and there was no way to identify her from the image. I didn't believe she'd give a D. She became enraged. I'd never seen her that enraged before. She was prepared to battle for that photograph, but I made every attempt to keep it away from her. She tried to tear it, but she couldn't. I told her to give it to me and I'd chop it up. She takes out a pen and begins marking it, then finds scissors and cuts it up. I set fire to the remnants in front of her. She remained enraged for some time and lectured me on how she did not want any naked images of herself to ever exist. I can't express how much she despised the notion of anybody possessing nudes of her. She was astounded. She didn't speak to me for almost a week, and we were on the verge of breaking up, but she eventually accepted that I didn't believe it would have affected her, and that I would never attempt it again. Now let's go on. I had my plan in place, and we had made preparations for her to come to my house. I shared a nice home with my closest buddy, yet I lived like a bachelor. My room featured just a bed, a computer table with a chair, a dresser, and an alarm clock on the floor next to my bed. I went to the kitchen and retrieved an additional chair to put at the foot of my bed. I went out and acquired another alarm clock, which I placed on the chair. I wanted it to seem blatantly out of place. We had after she came over. I maintained my calm and continued having 2-3 times each week for another 2 weeks or so. I made a point of trying various postures and keeping her tilted such that the alarm clock was gazing straight at her. I wanted to keep going, but I felt it was time to call it quits. On the final day, I disconnected the clock, placed it next to my computer, and moved the chair to a different room. I made sure she saw me, but I pretended to be cleaning up. Because I understood how cruel my plan was, I began to have second thoughts about it. I chose to wait a day, which grew into 2, and then I decided to call and confront her after approximately a week. I wasn't sure whether I was going to exact my vengeance or not. I called her and informed her I knew she was meeting her cousin. His name escapes me. She denied it, but I informed her that someone had told me they had seen them kissing. She eventually accepted it, but claimed it had just begun this week. I inquired, "How can your cousin?" She said, "He's not my cousin." We dispute some more, and I tell her I've known her for a month. Then she attempted to blame me for not saying anything when she found out, and she made a pretty smart statement that I can't recall. I then informed her that there was one more thing she needed to know. Me. Do you recall the alarm clock that was sitting on the chair next to my bed? Yes, she says. Me. Have you ever pondered why it was there? Her. No, Not at all. Me. Remember how we did Dobby at the foot of the bed, cowgirl with you facing the foot, and so forth, the past few times we had? Her, what the heck are you talking about? Me. It was a spy camera, you filthy, disgusting cheating. I smashed the phone on the ground. For whatever reason, I dialed from a pay phone. For the following few hours, my pager blew up. It didn't stop vibrating for 30 minutes after I switched it back on. My phone at home was inundated with voicemails. Her texts began with screams and tears, then threats, then pleading, then proposing bribes, and then she would repeat the pattern. She returned to my home the following day and pounded on the door for at least an hour, but I didn't respond. Even though the frequency had dropped significantly, the calls and texts continued to come in for weeks. She also came to my house a couple more times, but I never opened the door and was occasionally not there. I eventually answered the phone, but when she asked for the recordings, I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. I listened to her beg, scream, and plead, and finally chimed in with, "I'm not sure what cassettes you're talking about." I hung up the phone and never talked to her again. The phone calls and texts gradually ceased, and I went about my business. There was never a concealed camera, although she is unaware of this to this day. It was simply an old radio alarm clock that looked clunky enough to pass for a spy camera if you weren't looking. I came to regret it since it must have tormented her for a long time, but it just took me approximately 6 months to recover from my shattered heart. Story 2. Wife cheated 6 years ago. We stayed together recently. I have started thinking about it again. I have a really typical tale about cheating. Have you watched Netflix's Life? Yes, it is my life narrative with a few changes here and there. Despite being a postgraduate in economics, I was the person who was married to his profession and ignored my wife, who had opted to become a stay-at-home mother for our girls, 12 and 8. You'd think I'd struck gold by marrying this stunningly beautiful and well-educated lady. But, as you can understand from my narrative, I didn't cherish her or even our home life, and instead focused on my career. So, when our youngest was 2 years old and my wife was suffering from untreated PPD, she met her ex. They began communicating on Facebook, which has become a widely recognized cause of divorce throughout the globe. It was a 4-month emotional affair followed by 2 in-person meetings. I was seeing a shift in her demeanor, but I put it up to being a psalm to 2 very small and lively children. It bothered me, and I eventually asked her whether we were all right. I'm not sure whether it was her remorse or my pitiful expression when I asked, probably a combo of the two, but she gave a complete confession. We spoke a lot throughout the night, and it was nearly dawn before we agreed not to divorce and to work on our marriage. We went to individual and couples counseling, improved our communication, found some things to do together, and began dating. It was challenging at first, but I can honestly say that we are currently at our strongest as a couple in love. So, what's the point of this piece, you may ask? So, I ran into the person she cheated on me with at a wedding my wife and I were both attending. He really came over to say hello to us, but my wife ignored him and I could only stare at him in disdain. My wife saw that it must be tough for me and suggested that I leave early. So we left early, but that meeting happened a month ago, and I can't get it out of my head. It was the first time I met him following the event, so that may be one of the reasons. But I truly want to get him out of my head and go back to way I was before I met him.